Welcome to Sabs podcast. I'm your host, Sabrina Salvati. My special guest today is Professor Richard WOLFF. He's an economist, an author, a speaker, and a radio host. Thanks for coming on, Professor WOLFF.
I'm glad to be here. Thank you for inviting me.
So my first question for you is, when would you say that you first realized that capitalism was problematic?
I think it was as a child. I think that my father was himself a critic of the system, and he was very concerned not to impose his views on me about anything. You know, he had come from a very strict family where his parents hadn't hesitated at all, and he was determined not to do that to my sister and me as his children. So he was very careful. On the other hand, when I asked questions, which I did, he gave me the answer he thought was the truth. And I think from my earliest days, it started out with me asking questions. And I remember the first time I was 7 years of age. We were living in a suburb of New York City. And when you live in that suburb, you sit on the train that takes the commuters in and out of the city every day. We lived in a town called New Rochelle. It's a pretty well-known half-hour or so out of New York in Westchester County. And the train that goes into Grand Central Station passes through Harlem, in that part of Manhattan. And I remember going with my father. I was always very excited to go into the big city with my father, and he would take me to lunch in a restaurant. It was a very big event for me, which is part of why it's in my head. And the train stops at a place called 125th Street, which is or was and is in Harlem. And the train goes very close to the buildings, so you can see literally into people's apartments. And I noticed two things: that these people were poor, they didn't have much. And I also noticed that they were Black. And I asked my father, what's this about? And my father, and I'll remember this all my life, gave me a lecture. There's about 20 minutes from 125th Street to Grand Central Station, which is the last stop of the train in Midtown Manhattan. And on those 20 minutes, most of which are underground, he explained to me that in this country, the United States, there's a group of people, African Americans, we didn't call them that then, but we call them that now, who are systematically badly treated. They're not given the jobs, the educations, the opportunities. It is outrageous. It is an indecent way for human beings to interact with one another. And you know what I picked up? It wasn't so much the specifics that he said. It was his passion. I was suddenly seeing something come out of my father that I knew, the way a child does, that this is important. This is very important. And then I did something I think many children do. I went back to that topic because I wanted that part of my father more often. I came up with questions because he really wanted me to see what he had to say. And so it was a bond, basically, between me and my father. And I think that's where my earliest impulses came. And then as I grew older and went to high school and college, we always talked, my father and I learned that he was a critic of capitalism. And I was very, very taken with his arguments. I had a rough time in school because my teachers pushed back, to say the least. I'm being polite here. But having them push back, both in high school and college, was very good for me because I had to develop my arguments. I had to defend what I wanted to think and say against all of the arguments that could be thrown against my point of view as it was emerging. And I think that sharpened me. I think that was a kind of testing that ended up making me stronger and better able to articulate what it is I believe.
Awesome. Yeah, I used to live in New York, so I'm familiar with New Rochelle. The first time I went there, it was my roommate was like, "We need to go to New Rochelle because my storage unit's there." And I was like, "What's outside of New York City? I don't understand." I was like, but I want to ask you a question about the pandemic and the economy because I'm starting to hear people around me say that they're starting to get very comfortable. And that makes me a little concerned because people are saying, well, businesses are opening back up and the job rate is good. And I'm trying to tell people and convince them that, like, listen, I know a lot of people that are laid off that still cannot find a job. So I don't know where you're getting your information from, but it's not as great as it would sound. How does it make you feel to hear that people are starting to get comfortable with the economy again? And can the economy tank again?
Well, let me answer the second part first. And I'm going to put on my hat as a professional economist, which I've been all my life, to answer the question. Can the economy tank again? The answer is an absolute 100% yes, absolutely. Look, this capitalist economy tanks every 4 to 7 years. It's been doing that for 300 years. So it's not a question of whether it'll tank. It's really only a question of when exactly. On average, capitalism tanks every 4 to 7 years. In every country where it's become the dominant system, that's what it does. Every 4 to 7 years, suddenly, large numbers of people are thrown out of work and have no job. Large numbers of businesses cut back or go out of business. We have lots of words in our language for these things. The crash, the depression, the recession, the breakdown, the downturn. I mean, and we have a lot of words because it's really part of our lives. We have it every 4 to 7 years. Look, let me give you an example of the current 21st century. We had something called the dot-com crash in the year 2000. Then we had the so-called subprime mortgage crash in the year 2008. And then in 2020, last year, we had the so-called COVID-19 crash. Guess what? 20 years of a century, 3 crashes, once every 7 years, right on schedule. There's nothing about calling them by these other names. It's just an effort to make people think that each time you have this crash, it's about something else. It's about stock prices or people who can't cover their mortgage or a virus. That's not the problem. If it hadn't been the virus, it would have been something else. If it hadn't been it's a little bit like having a roommate and discovering that you're sharing a fridge, and every time you go to the fridge to get a snack or to eat your lunch, the food that you bought the day before is gone. And your roommate says, oh yeah, Fred from across the hall came by and he ate it. Or Louise, who bopped in from out of town. After a while, you begin to realize, even if there's some truth to it, your roommate is got a problem with food. And that's the issue here, not the visit of your friend Victoria from out of town. So yes, there's going to be a downturn. The only question is, when exactly, how long will it last, and how bad will it be? That varies. But the fact that we live in a system like this, when I give a lecture in my classes and I explain this to students, I usually come to this point, I lean across the podium, try to look into the audience, and I say something like this. If you lived with a roommate as unstable as capitalism, you would have moved out long ago. We live in an economic system we would not otherwise tolerate. And from my point of view, we shouldn't have tolerated it to this point either. Now, let me go to the first part of your question. I think you're probably more right than you know. This is a unique moment in American history that people do not quite understand. We have had economic downturns before, but this one is a real doozy. The only one like this one is something we call the Great Depression from the 1930s. So we've had this before, but this is very bad. But we've never before had a crash of the economy at the same time that we have a public health catastrophe. We have had viruses before, but not together with an economic depression. This combination, at the same time in our country, a COVID disaster that has killed over 600,000 of our fellow citizens, together with an economic crash on the scale of the 1930s, this at the same time, we've never had that before. So partly this is you have to recognize there's nothing here to compare this to. We've never had this. Over the last 18 months, more than half of the American labor force, which we number around 160 million people, roughly half of our population, are what we call the labor force. Those are adults that are healthy, that are looking for work. More than half of them, more than 1 out of 2, had to go and file unemployment papers because they were out of work. Some for only a few days or weeks, others for the whole 15, 16, 17 months, and everything in between. We've never had that before. Half of our people were unemployed, during which time they didn't get the kind of money they normally do. They probably had to dip into any savings that they'd been managed to accumulate, or they became burdens on their family and friends because they were out of work. And I'm not even talking about the psychological effects on people that we know all about. You look at the statistics when there's unemployment, alcoholism goes up, drug use goes up, breakups with your significant other happen more readily. There's more domestic violence. You name it, our social problems get worse. All of that is happening more than ever right now. And of course, sad, but it's true, the business community had to discover a very profound lesson. If you don't have workers coming to work because you don't pay them enough, or because they're afraid of getting sick, they don't want COVID, they've already lost a relative, they know what that's like. You discover, if you're an employer, that without a worker, you don't make any profits. You can have all the best machines in the world. You can have the tools. You can have the equipment. You can have the modern factory. You can have the computerized office. But if you don't have that human being, you don't got nothing. You're not going to make any money. You're not going to earn any profits. So many, many businesses. Think of every restaurant that was closed. Think of every department store that was closed for weeks, for months. They're all desperate. This is so important. Desperate to get people back to work. They don't want to wait. For them, if you get sick as a worker, you get COVID, there's plenty of others out there that they'll hire in your place. They don't want to lose out. I'm going to be blunt, but it's the truth. With a few exceptions, they don't care. They're trying to recover from a blow they took. And they want those people back. That's why they're the political people that they put into office are out there. We're getting people back to work. You shouldn't be doing that. You should be keeping people at home until the health disaster passes. And let me give you an example. The People's Republic of China, and in case that's the wrong example because they're a socialist country, I'll pick New Zealand, which isn't one. Those two countries closed down. They didn't hesitate. They locked complete cities, complete provinces. They said, you stay at home. We will pay your wages and salaries. That's not the issue. The factory is going to close. The stores are going to close. The buses aren't going to run. Nothing, because we have to defeat the disease. If we have an economy and we're all dead or sick, what possible use is it? This is crazy. We're going to do the first. We didn't do that in this country. We didn't want a lockdown. We don't want to do it. Look at President Trump. He pretended we didn't have a problem. That's how far gone he was. Look at the people now who don't want a vaccination, who don't want to do anything because we can all get back to work. We won't let the country be shut down. We just lost 600,000 people that are dead, millions that will have illnesses for the rest of their lives because of the long-term consequences of this disease. We could have shut the country down the way the Chinese did. The Chinese have a tiny fraction of the number of deaths we do, even though their population is 4 times larger than that of the United States. I mean, we are one of the richest countries in the world, and we did a bad job. And countries much poorer than us took better care of their people. So for me, this is all a demonstration that capitalism doesn't work anymore, and that we ought to be in a debate in this country, not just about how to deal with COVID, but to face up to the fact we weren't prepared for COVID. We didn't have the tests we needed. We still haven't tested huge numbers of our people. We didn't hold down the spread of the disease. And now we are doing a half-baked job of this vaccination. I mean, it is a pathetic demonstration of a system that is busted. And I think it's my job to say so. And I'm willing to debate anybody, to argue about it, but we have to face it. You know, I'm part of the kind of generation that believes in order to fix it, you first got to face it. If you need to pretend there's no problem, then you're like the person who drinks too much, but insists that he or she is no alcoholic. You got to get them to understand, no, you got a problem. You can fix it, but you got to first face it.
Well said. I want to get your opinion about gentrification in the economy, because this is a huge problem that I've seen in Boston. Boston used to be a working class city, and I've watched it over the past couple of years become more of a professional city because of gentrification, and the working class population has been pushed further and further out of Boston, which means they have a longer commute going to work now. If this continues to go on unchecked, what do you think will be the effects on the economy if we don't find a way to curb this? Because landlords are continuing to increase the rent because they know the professionals will pay for it. And I'm talking in communities that were considered like lower income communities here in Boston. Those people are pushed further out now because of gentrification.
Well, first of all, it's happening in almost all of our big cities, not just Boston. In other words, you're putting a finger on a problem that's very widespread in the United States. Okay, so here's the basic economics of what's going on. Over the last 40 years, American corporations, businesses of all sizes, but particularly the big ones, the ones that had factories in a dozen different American cities and offices and warehouses in 20 more. Those entities provided jobs for millions of Americans. And they provided jobs all over the place, in big cities, but also in medium-sized cities, even in small towns, all over the place. And they made a decision, a profit-driven decision. And that was that they could make more profits going abroad because they could pay workers way less than they paid American workers' wages and salaries. Let me give you an example. Once upon a time, we had an enormous automobile industry in and around Detroit. General Motors, Ford, Chrysler, everybody knows about it. It made Detroit, say back in 1970, the most successful capitalist city in this country. Presidents would take visitors from other countries and fly from Washington to Detroit to show the visitor, look at this. This is a thriving city. By the way, the population of Detroit back in 1970, nearly 2 million people. And not only was it a big and successful city, but it was a big, successful city based on working class people, the people who worked in the auto factories. And they were men and women, and they were white and black. And that was very unusual in the United States, particularly back then. So it was like a showcase. Well, here's what happened. Ford, General Motors, and Chrysler left They moved their production to where they could pay workers less. First, it was to Canada, then it was to the American South, then it was to Mexico, and in recent years to China. General Motors sells more cars in China today than it does in the United States. China is more important to General Motors than the American market is. And when the car companies went to China, they didn't want to buy their batteries or their headlights or their tire components from a company outside of Chicago or outside of Detroit or somewhere in the Midwest. They needed to get it from another factory out there in China, wherever they were located. In other words, the demand for American manufacturing vanished, and with it, tens of millions of jobs left. And here's then what happened. When the factory closes down, and if you want, anyone listening or watching this program, visit Detroit, you'll see. Detroit today has a population of 700,000, down from almost 2 million. That means the majority of the people of Detroit were driven out of the city because there was no work. And you know what happens? The city fell apart. If there's nobody working, there's no one buying things. Then there's nobody paying taxes at the grocery store. Then the city has no money. Then it cuts back on what it pays its school teachers. And then nobody wants to teach there. And then the schools deteriorate. I mean, you can just see it. We've been watching this for the last 50 years in the United States. And as the towns and cities deteriorate, here's what happens. It becomes unpleasant living there. It becomes difficult living there. It becomes dangerous in some cases to live there. And guess what? The people who have any money, the professionals, for example, they leave. They want to go to a place where they can go for a walk in the evening and amble out to the restaurant this day and the movies the next day and a nice little shopping area. That they don't want to be part of the disintegration of the economic system. So they go to one of the fun cities, Boston, New York, San Francisco, Atlanta. You know them. We all know them, right? And when they get there, they're the people who have enough money to leave Toledo, Ohio, or Chicago, or Detroit. They're the ones with some money. Maybe they saved them, maybe they got them from their parents, who knows? And so they come in, they don't have a lot of money, but they have enough to leave, Missouri and come to Boston. And they want to live there. They can't afford the fancy areas of Boston. So they go to the poor areas and they offer higher rent or to pay a higher price than the people who live there now. And that's gentrification. They push them out. They force them into poorer suburbs. They force them to have that long commute. It's so sad. They take these vibrant neighborhoods that were neighborhoods for a long time, and they make them into their little playgrounds. Pretty soon the people, who lived there before can't afford to pay the grocery bill, can't afford to go to those restaurants. It's not Popeyes, it's not McDonald's, it's a sit-down restaurant, and now it's got a tablecloth, and now, you know the story. Look, we've been watching this for, as I say, 40 or 50 years. If there was a commitment, either by the political authorities or by the corporations, not to have this happen, they could have and they should have taken those steps 50 years ago, 40 years ago, 30 years ago. They didn't do it. And so now we have everybody wanting to go and have a nice time in the lovely gentrified downtown that's been redone in Philadelphia or Baltimore or anywhere else. And all the people who can't afford that, which is the vast majority of Americans, white and black, they're pushed out. They're the ones left in those broken down cities in the Midwest that can't function. or who have to live on the fringes of the big cities with those long commutes, so they can go and work in the restaurant where the people are having dinner, which they can't afford, but they're the dishwasher, or they're the waitress, or they're the fill in the blank. It's a terrific breakdown of our society. There's no nice way to say this. That's why people are so upset these days. That's why you see the divisions. That's why you see people get crazy about having a gun. You know, you can have 10 guns in your truck. That's not going to save you from this. It's a little bit of a craziness. Your life is falling apart, but you're decided, if only I can get another gun in my truck. I mean, you know, this is a sad, what psychologists call displacement. You're bothered by something, but you don't know quite what it is. You don't know what to do about it. So you displace your upset onto something else, and you become enthusiastic about, I don't know, a Donald Trump who waves his hand in the air and tells you he's going to fix everything. I mean, it's complete bull, and you know that somewhere, but you don't know where to turn. The situation keeps getting worse for most people, and that's the reality.
Agreed. I want to get your opinion about racism and capitalism, because I've heard people in the past say that racism and capitalism are actually linked. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Yes, they are linked. And the best way I know how to explain it is to go back to what we talked about a few minutes ago about the instability of capitalism, that every 4 to 7 years, suddenly there's a downturn. And some of them are short and shallow, others of them are long and deep. But here's the problem. Who gets fired? Who exactly is going to be the sacrificial lamb, if you like, every 4 to 7 years when millions are thrown out of work? If everybody in the working class was at risk, how would we live our lives? For example, how could I put down money to buy a home, knowing I'm going to have to make my monthly mortgage payment, but then every 4 to 7 years, I could be bounced out on my rear end, losing my job, losing my income, and then I'd lose my house too because I couldn't make the mortgage payment. So how would I do that? If every 4 to 7 years I lose my job, I have to eat into my savings. How am I going to build up the savings to send my kid to college? I can't do it. So if capitalism had to threaten all of its working class with being bounced out of work, I mean, you might not get it this time. This time you might escape. You might keep your job across the downturn. But then the odds are the next downturn, and they happen every 4 to 7 years, and most of us live 50, 60, 70 years, so we're going to have a lot of them. They're going to get us sooner or later. If that were true, I think we would have had revolutions against capitalism, and you and I would be talking about something that was no longer with us, some historical thing, right? Like we might talk about slavery, or we might talk about feudalism, things that were but aren't anymore. Well, capitalism solved the problem, and here comes the racism. Capitalism solved the problem by saying to one part of the population, don't you worry, this job you will keep. Up to good times, bad times, we'll keep you. There's another group of people, they're going to be what I call shock absorbers. When the times are good, we'll hire them. But the minute the downturn comes, they're fired. There used to be a phrase for that. Last hired, first fired. The people who get the job at the last moment and the ones that are bounced out at the first. Well, there have been 2 or 3 groups in the United States who've been assigned that role. African Americans, women, used to be. When I was a kid, I remember hearing people say, oh, when the women go to work, it's just for, and I don't know if you know this phrase, pin money. In other words, it was money that would allow them to get ribbons or a nice blouse or some, but it wasn't like they really needed it. I mean, this was complete bull at that time because women were already having to work because the family finances couldn't have survived otherwise. But it was a way of handling women the way African Americans were handled. Namely, when there's lots of jobs, sure, we'll hire you. But the minute the thing goes down, you're out. You're the ones that lose a job. And the third group in this country over recent years has been the Latino population. So you have the African Americans, the Latino, and the women. They were the shock absorbers. When the system shocked down, they got pushed out. When the system came back, they got brought in. The important thing is that the white, particularly the white male, people like me, our jobs were secure. We could look at the downturn and say how sad it was, but it wasn't me that was without work. It was my wife. It was my African-American, neighbor. It was the Latino family that moved in. They're the ones who took the brunt of it. So for me, racism comes in at this point because, white workers might have been able to develop the understanding this system sucks and it's not firing us, but it is treating these other people in a terrible way. We don't want any part of this. Instead, they were told a different story. Those people, the women, the African American, the Latino, there's something wrong with them. There's something different. Their skin color or their gender or their language. It's their fault. They're not losing their job because the economy is unstable. They're losing their job because they don't work hard or they aren't disciplined or they don't go to school properly. In other words, and this is the only way to be honest about it, you blame the victim. It's like saying when an out of control man attacks a woman and is asked afterwards, what the hell is the matter with you? It says, well, she wore a tight dress or something like that. In other words, you're blaming the victim. You can't control yourself, but you're blaming the victim. Well, in this case, you can't dare criticize capitalism, which is the problem. So you blame the people that are unemployed, the people who can't keep their jobs, the people who have to go through using up their savings, the people who have to go through the psychological burden of being unemployed, being unwanted, thinking badly about yourself because you don't have a job and you don't have money in your pocket. In other words, you make these people the shock absorber and then you blame them. That's the racism. The racism comes because it's an ideology. I mean, I don't believe in race. I don't think that the amount of melanin or whatever it is in your skin that makes you brown or white or not, who cares? It's about as interesting as the shape of the curve of your ear. I mean, we all differ about that. It's not interesting. How do you make that a big deal? Well, you need to explain, well, this is the explanation. You can now say these people that are identifiable as a female, or as an African American, or as a Latino by their language, by their skin color, whatever, you can then say they're in their tough situation, not because capitalism has to put someone there, but because there's something wrong with them. And for me, that's how racism supports capitalism, keeps it going, because it says, if you can just get those white males to be grateful that they are not the ones being treated the way the women and the African Americans and the Latinos are, well, then you can convince them that they are a race that's superior, that their whiteness means anything. There's a kind of pathetic desperation of white supremacists. I mean, they're aggressive and they're mean, but they're also desperate to come up with something as lame as that because they can't face that they're being used by an economic system, which is the reality.
Well said. I want to get your opinion about minimum wage, because a lot of us on the left, we were fighting for a $15 minimum wage. Obviously, that did not pass. But I want to know, what do you feel the minimum wage should be today if we're looking at basing it on inflation? What do you feel the minimum wage should be today? And what do you think will happen if we don't increase the minimum wage?
Okay, for me, I'll answer your question, but let me start by saying that for me, the minimum wage story in this country is it it's beyond words. It gets me so upset that I have to kind of take a deep breath and calm myself down. So let's first begin. The minimum wage, the federal minimum wage, because states can set their own minimum wage, and they do, but there's a federal for the government, for the country as a whole, is $7 right now, is $7.25 an hour. Now, unless you're very dishonest, you understand that nobody can live a decent life in this society, let alone in any city, on $7.25 an hour. Okay, so it's an abomination. Every other industrial country in the world has a higher minimum wage. I mean, let's be clear. We live in one of the richest countries in the world, but we pay our workers a lower minimum wage. The minimum wage in most of Western Europe is around $11 or $12 an hour, not $7.25. In Australia and New Zealand, it's $16 an hour. Now, they're not fighting for 15 because 15 would be a drop for them. Many of the same companies that are paying people over there $16 an hour are insisting to pay the minimum here $8, $9, $10 an hour. They could pay more, but they don't want to because it's more profit in their pocket. Number two, the last time the minimum wage was raised by the Congress was in the year 2009. Here's what that means. Every year since 2009, and stay with me, that's 12 years ago. Every one of the last 12 years, prices have gone up in the United States, sometimes only by a little, sometimes by quite a bit. For example, over the last year, from July of 2020 to July of 2021, the inflation rate in this country is in the neighborhood of 5 to 6%. If every one of the last 12 years prices went up, but the minimum wage stayed the same, it means that a person who got the minimum wage, $7.25 an hour, could afford less and less each year because the prices he or she had to pay went up each year, but their wage per hour didn't. In other words, in terms of the real value the minimum wage worker got, it was going down every year. Over the last 12 years, the richest people in America became much, much richer. There are 650 billionaires, roughly, in the United States. Over the last 10 years, their total wealth grew by tens of billions of dollars, side by side with the minimum wage worker who saw his or her $7.25 an hour afford less and less of the rising prices they were paying for their haircut or their Rice Krispies or their soda pop or whatever else they were buying. The inequality, I mean, I don't know of any religion, of any ethics that could possibly justify a society that works like this. Now, the last thing, the fight for 15. Of course, I support the fight for 15 because the lives of people living on $7.25 is so outrageous that, I mean, any simpleton would be in favor of that. And I'm happy to say that most polls show that most Americans are in favor of raising that because they understand what kind of life you're going to have if you live on that. But let me tell you, most of the proposals, even the ones that didn't pass yet, are about raising it in stages between now and the year 2025, so that it would go up a little and then more, and it would reach that $15 an hour level in the year 2025. But if we're having inflation now of rising prices of 5% per year, that means it will have gone up, prices will have gone up 25% roughly by 2025, which means the value of $15 then will be what $12 is now, roughly. In other words, you're doing away with the very rationale. So you want my blunt answer? It should be $30 to $40 an hour. That's what workers demand. That's what they need. That's what they should have gotten. It's what they would be having now if their minimum was raised along with all the other prices in our society. If they were going to be keeping up, if they were going to be experiencing the same improvement in their standard of living that rich people did, not more, just the same rate of increase, that's what they would get. I am amazed that the American working class isn't angrier than it is. It has every right to be. It is being abusively treated. And I find it, unspeakable that the same politicians with their $1 million wealth and their $1 million salaries and connections are unable to vote to give people who are their fellow citizens more than $7. And it's such a statement about the United States. Let me end with this here. My father was born in France, in Europe. So I've spoken French all my life, and I speak French now, and I follow events in France. For many decades, the French people take for granted certain things that the working class in France fought for and won. I'm going to mention them because I want an American audience to ask itself why we don't have that here. So I'm going to give you some examples. Under the law in France, a law pushed through many, many years ago, because this has been true what I'm about to tell you for a long time, pushed through by the socialists who have their own party in France, and that party has been the government many times over the last 30 years. The socialists pushed through a law which has never been repealed. Even when socialists lost elections and conservatives came in, they did not dare mess with this law because they would have had a revolution on their hands. Here's the law. Whenever you graduate from high school or college and you become a member of the labor force in France, it just means your schooling is over and now you're going to look for and take a job as an adult. Under the law in France, wherever you work, your employer must give you, from the day you start, 5 weeks of paid vacation every year. See that? Look at your own reaction. See that? Wonderful. And wonderful. That's the reaction I get. And that's not new. That's been around for that's been around your entire life. It's older than you are. Everybody who could should know about this. In the United States, you can work for 30 years for an employer and not get 5 weeks of paid vacation after 30 years. You get it in France after 30 minutes, it's yours. Let me give you another example. This one I'm going to take from Germany, country right next door to France. In Germany, you can go to any one of, they have excellent colleges and universities in Germany, some of the best in the world. The tuition at a German university, you ready? 0. There is no tuition. There are no fees. All you have to do if you're a student at a German university, you have to pay for your room and board. You have to pay for your food that you eat and wherever you sleep, your apartment or whatever you have. That's your business. But you don't pay for education. Not only do the Germans do that for German people, but the Germans do it for anyone. there are currently 20,000 Americans getting their college degrees in Germany because they don't have to pay for it. That means you don't have to go into debt to get your college degree, the way Americans have. An average debt in the United States of a college student right now, $40,000. That's the average. There are some who have 100 or 150, 200. And if you go on to law school or med school or anything else, I mean, it just goes into the stratosphere how much you borrow. But what a crazy thing. The Germans explain this. We want our people educated. If we have an educated labor force, it'll be more productive. It'll be able to contribute more to the society. We're investing in making our society better. Well, you want to explain to me why doesn't that apply in this country? Not only are we not making it easier, but the prices of college have gone up faster than inflation, which is why everybody has to borrow to go to school these days, which means you graduate with a big debt load hanging over you. You know, I still teach, so I talk to my students. They're not getting married, they're not having children because they can't work it out. Neither the young men nor the young women, because they're being burdened. When I went to college, I didn't have to borrow money. My parents didn't have much money, but I had a job in the summer and I managed it. I didn't have to borrow. If I went to school today, of course I'd have to borrow. A person like me. The Germans don't do that. Why do the Americans permit themselves to be treated like this? I go back to France where I have family. Anyone in my family gets sick, from the day the baby is born until the day the old man or woman dies, they're covered by a national health policy. They don't pay. They don't have to. They don't worry about it. Got nothing to do with your employer. If you leave one job and go to another, it doesn't make any difference. It's one system. If you don't have a job, you're just as eligible as if you do. No employer can abuse you by threatening to fire you and then you lose your health. That doesn't exist there. They don't have that. When I explain, and when I go to France, which I do often, and I explain to them how the American system works, the people sit there and shake their heads, and they all ask me one question over and over again. Why do the American people permit themselves to be treated like this? Nobody in France worries if they get injured, if they get sick. They're taken care of. That's it. You don't worry. I mean, you don't want to get sick and you don't want to get injured for all the usual reasons, but you don't worry. You don't worry about some bill you're going to get, some crazy thousands of bill that you can get yourself sick with worry if you weren't already sick enough with whatever illness you have, because you can't afford to pay it, because the insurance company is nickel and diming you, doesn't want to cover whatever your problem was. Look, they don't have any of that, none of it. And I could go on and on. If you have more than one child, give you another example. This one is from France. If you have more than one child, you automatically qualify for a subsidy from the government to help you take care of a second or third or fourth or any number. In other words, the first child, that's your responsibility. But if you have more than one child, which you're free to do if you want, all that, then the government gives you a subsidy. For 18 years, you will get for each kid to help you, and it's to help you pay for the food, the clothing, whatever fees and problems your child may have. That's considered what you do in this country. And it's just, and America is a place which talks forever about family values. But what does it do to help a poor family? Nothing. Nothing compared to what other countries are doing. When you become pregnant in France, young woman is pregnant, whether you're married or not, whether you've had another kid, once the baby comes, the government assigns a social worker to help you certain number of hours a week. Nope, doesn't cost you a nickel. A person comes, could be a man, could be a woman, and their job is to help you do the laundry, to do the shopping, to bathe the baby, to change the baby. Your job is to help. The government is helping you raise your family. You don't have to, by the way, if you don't want it, you don't have to take it. You're not obliged to, but you're free to, and the government picks that up. I mean, I could go on, but when you understand it, by the way, this is common across Europe. It's in Holland, it's in Scandinavia, it's in Italy, it's in Spain. There's slight variations, but they basically do all of this. Anyway, you just come home, you get on that airplane, you come back and you arrive at JFK Airport and you re-enter American society and you shake your head in wonderment that the American working people have been denied all of this and have been denied the quality of life they could have had and could have now if they got these kinds of supports, just as a part of what being a citizen is. A French person once pointed out to me that she had visited New York City and her American hosts one afternoon, I think Saturday afternoon, got a blanket and some beers and some fried chicken, and they went into Central Park and they put their blankets down on the grass in some meadow, and they spent the afternoon hanging out and drinking the beer and eating the chicken. And she said, all I could think of while I was there enjoying myself with them was that, look, you have a city that maintains a beautiful park, takes care of the trees and the flowers and the meadow, and there's the big garbage can. We can put our garbage in the garbage. You appreciate, you like it that you can go on Saturday and have a picnic with your friends in a beautiful park, don't you? Yes. Well, tell me, we have that in France too, but we also have free education, free medical care, 5-week paid vacation. You don't get those other things, but they would be just as important in making your life better as Central Park is in giving you the opportunity of having that picnic with your friends. And there's no response to that. They're right. It's and it makes me angry at a system that works like this and that fills the airways, not your program, obviously, but fills the airways with one rationale, one BS after another about why we can't have this, why we can't afford it. We're a rich country, richer than most of those others. They can afford it. You want to tell me why we can't?
Agreed. I agree with everything you just said. There was something you brought up. This is my last question for you. You mentioned your students, and the question that I had is, what advice would you give to like millennials and Gen Z generation, those of us who, a lot of us, like you said, have chosen like we can't buy a house or they can't get married and all of those things. What advice would you give them in reference to like, is that the way to continue to go about it? Should we try to save up for these things to happen, or should we just continue what a lot of us have been doing, which is enjoying like experiences instead?
Well, that's a good question. That's a hard question. Let me tell you what I wish for, then I'll try to answer your question. I am somewhat embarrassed, maybe even I should say ashamed, that my generation didn't do a better job of changing this society for your generation. I think we would have been happier had we done a better job as a group changing this world from the way we found it. And my hope is that you do. My hope, look, what's going to happen in this country, you're going to make that decision. People like you, people your age, people thinking like you are, you're going to make a change. That's my hope. That's my most. And if I could plead with all of you, and I'll use, talking to you, so I'll focus on you. If I could plead with you, it would be to use the same good brain that made up these questions you've been asking me, to use it to make change in this country. The country is desperate to be fixed, to be changed. It's a mess, and it isn't getting any better. Having said that, now let me put my hat on as an economist, and this may get you slightly depressed. In my judgment, looking at the history of this country and the economic system we live in, the best days of American capitalism are behind us, not ahead of us. We are an economic system that had a really good run from roughly 1820 to roughly 1970, 150 years of really going up compared to most other countries. Rising wages, rising standard of living, some parts of the population a lot more than others. It wasn't an equal ride, but it was a ride up. In the 1970s, that came to an end. And then we coasted for a while. And by coasting, I mean wages stopped going up, but Americans borrowed more money than anyone had ever borrowed before. And that kept it going another few decades into this century we're living in now. But now this is a system that is in decline. We have given the role of the rising new economic power to another country. It's called China. And it's something your generation is going to have to come to terms with. China is what we in America were. They're the ones taking off. They're the ones growing. The difference is they have 1.4 billion people, 4 Chinese for every American. They're a much, much larger country, and they're going to go very, very far. They already compete with the United States at the highest levels of technology. They have their own Amazon, their own Google, their own Apple, they don't need the United States. They've learned how to do all that stuff, and they're very good at it. What that means is that, to be blunt, American capitalism is in decline. The leaders don't admit it because you lose elections if you're honest like that. They pretend we're still the big United States. It's kind of embarrassing in the rest of the world because everybody knows who pays attention what's going on. So here's the problem to answer your question. When an economy goes down, the people in it, if it's set up like ours is, it's kind of everybody grab it before it disappears. You ever been at a party, it's late in the evening, the party's kind of breaking up, but there's still a lot of food on the table or bottles of beer, and everybody kind of snatches it, so the party can continue maybe a little later at somebody else's house. We're a system in which the different parts of our economy are snatching whatever they can. They all kind of know it's going down. And the people in the position to snatch the most are the corporate leaders, the people who run the big businesses. They're in a position, and that's what they're doing, grabbing as much as they can. They're trying to hold on to a declining system. That's not a fun situation. It's a lot more fun when the ride is up, and a lot less fun when the ride is down. But here comes the bad news. As the thing goes down, the people at the top hold on better because they have more resources than everybody else. So they hold on, and what's left trickles down to everybody else. And everybody fights to keep a piece of it, which means that much less of it for the person one rung down on the ladder. So that means that people, working class people, poor people, minority groups, women, they're the ones on whom the burden of this decline is going to be pushed. You can see it already with the students. This is the first generation of students to be loaded up with debt. Students who go to school are becoming more productive citizens. The society should invest in that. The society should pick up the cost. Look, that's why we have public schools. In the middle of the 19th century, we created a public school system. From kindergarten through the 12th grade, you don't pay. The public picks up the cost of that building, of those textbooks, of the teacher in the classroom with you, of the school nurse, of the library, all the things you need. Well, why doesn't that apply to college and university? It's part of the education system. But they don't want to do that. They don't even want to do what they used to do, so they make you borrow the money. They put the burden on you so that they don't have to pay the tax and they can keep it to themselves. You're going to have the millennials and Gen Zs, you're going to live in an economic system that is going down and wants to give you only what's left, and what's left isn't very attractive. It's like picking your blouse out of the bin in the store after 50 other people have been through that same bin before you got there. There'll be some blouses left, but it won't be the ones you might have gotten if you were better positioned or came earlier. That's the reality. And I think most of you already know it. You know that a good, secure job at a good, secure pay, that's not available. You're already becoming used to the notion, I'm going to have a little job over here on Tuesdays, and then over there, I'm going to work Friday to Saturday, and then you're going to cobble together a life. Yeah, that's what's left at the bottom. The good job, which gives you a little more every year, so you can afford a rising standard of living. Those jobs are disappearing. They went overseas. What's left for you? You're going to be what? A fast food worker? You're going to greet people at Walmart. You're going to bust your neck moving stuff around in an Amazon warehouse, and on and on and on. These kinds of jobs that are being created here, they're not the jobs you went to school for. They're not the jobs your parents taught you to believe maybe you could get. They're not the jobs you were hoping for. You're facing that in a concrete way. But don't let anyone tell you that this is your fault. Then you lose. Then you really lose. You are being abused by a system. And that system has to be changed. This economic system should be changed so it serves the people in it rather than abuse them the way it is. And I hate to go back to that example I used before, but it seems to be so appropriate. Don't allow the crime being committed against your generation to be made worse by blaming you for it. Don't allow them to blame the victim. Stand up and say, I and my generation, we want a better life. Let me give you an example to end this with. Between 2015 and 2019, a little country called Iceland, it's off the main part of Europe, they made an experiment demanded by their working class. The working class in Iceland said, we don't want to work 5 days a week. It makes it impossible for us to have a family life. It makes it impossible for us to have the kind of time off you need to be a human being, to be a decent husband, wife, mother, whatever. We want a 4-day week. Here's what we propose. We don't work 5 days a week, 8 hours. We work 4 days a week, 9 hours a day. That works out to 36 hours. So we want the work week reduced from 40 hours to 36 hours and from 5 days to 4 days. We think we'll be happier people, better rested people, and we'll be able to do the work we did before in 40 hours in 36. But we don't want any cut in our pay. We want to work 4 hours a week less and get paid the same amount of money. Well, you can imagine the yelling and the screaming, but they prevail because the working class is organized. So over the years 2015 to 2019, they made the experiment. They took tens of thousands of workers. They had them reduce the work week to 4 days. They measured the work they did. Are you more productive? Did you make it up? Could you do your work in 36 hours? Bottom line, yeah, they did the work and they did it as well or better than they had done it before. And the law has been changed, and the working class of Iceland, either about half of it now has a 4-day work week, and the other half has the right to it and is in the process of negotiating it. Now, Iceland doesn't have the wealth of the United States, nothing close to it. Japan just proposed to its citizens that they begin thinking of a transition to a 4-day work week. Here in the United States, can you imagine the conservatives, the business community jumping up and down, freaking out about this idea? But you know, the majority of people are working people. And if the majority is better off, isn't that the way it's supposed to go?
Yep.
Yeah, the employers are a very small minority, so they lose out a little bit, but the majority gains a lot. Democracy is supposed to work like that. This country doesn't treat its working class anything like what it could and what it should. My advice to you is work at that. Get together with other people, make change. That's the only way you're going to solve your problem. If you do it all as individuals, if each of, and that's my generation, so I'm not criticizing yours because I'm telling you what we did, and what we did was a mistake. Most of us tried to escape the problems of our time by finding a good job, by living in this community, by marrying that particular person. We could fashion a life despite the fact that the society was falling apart. That was a mistake. You're not going to solve these problems individually because they're not individual problems. They're social problems. And the only way you deal with a social problem is with a social movement. For me, and I tell you in all honesty, for me, it's the social movements happening in this country that give me hope. Over the summer, I was ecstatic because of Black Lives Matter, not the specifics of what they were doing, but there were so many people. They were getting together. They were marching in the street. They want things changed with the way the police work. And they want, whoa, that's what we need. Yep. And suddenly all of these young people calling themselves socialists and running for office, like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, people like that. That's what we need. Movement of people to get that will make it better for everybody.
Thanks so much, Professor Wolff. This has been a very educational interview. So I just want to thank you so much for coming on.
My pleasure.